these same blots and splashes religious symbols, figures of saints, and even in some instances the features of Christ. Therefore, what is there unmistakably becomes interpreted by our own imaging and projecting power. We can go even further than this. We can look around ourselves into almost any complicated pattern of environment and can use the very rooms and houses in which we live as a form of Rorschach structure or symbol. And we can transform the flow of draperies or the leaves of a tree outside our window into some significant shape by our own interpreting. This is done constantly. But because we consider this to be a psychological phenomenon, we are not overly perturbed. By further extension of the same process, however, realizing that imagery is not our ability actually to see something, that imagery is actually an integration in the brain of vibratory waves, of rates, that the picture that goes into the eye is not carried as a picture into the brain, but more like a television picture, is carried as energy in space between the object and the interpreting power. We are quite aware of the image creating or image integrating power of the mind itself. Now, it is not impossible that a mind heavily psychotically burdened can create involuntarily images which it can confuse with and mix with the normal image process which we use in seeing. Thus we can look out upon a scene, see a meadow that is there, trees that are there, and the phantom of the person we have injured, which is not there. We have imposed this phantom into our seeing by our own processes. Perhaps this is the reason, however, why the majority of ghost lore is associated with darkness. Darkness is a very strange catalyzing agent. In the light we are distracted by the forms of things as they are. But in darkness, strangely, darkness itself becomes a kind of curtain on which we can project almost any kind of imagery. Therefore, ghosts live at night, wander in darkness, and are peculiarly associated with the nocturnal experiences of man. They are involved in the negative or subjective psychic life, for man is much like day and night himself. He is objective in the daytime and subjective at night. And as his day processes and his day interests are gradually relaxed at night, his own internal becomes increasingly dominant, especially, of course, during hours of sleeping or near sleeping. So the ghost functions at this time, perhaps because at other times we are too concerned with objectives to become subjective to the impulses in ourselves. Now, wonder continues to rise why it is that man is unable to conjure, or very seldom able to conjure, benevolent spirits. We have to study a little bit into the psychology of peoples, perhaps to find some clue to this situation. Ever since man became aware of morality, ever since he became conscious of good and evil, and certainly from the time when the great codes of religion, morality, and ethics were first framed, from this time on, man began to experience a shortcoming. most people began to know or to sense that they were not keeping the codes and laws which they claimed to believe. Most individuals examining into themselves find some shade of guilt, even if it is in the more common experiences of life. We know we ought to be kindly, but we are unkind when we feel like it. We know that we ought to be paragons of truthfulness, but a fib now and then is naturally indulged, especially if there's a little profit in it. We know that we should be fair, but we don't enjoy being fair. We enjoy doing what we want to and condemning other people if we feel like it. We know that we should be temperate, honorable, thoughtful people. But all of these virtues seem difficult to attain, and we have very little libido dedicated to that purpose. What we really want to do is what we please, and as we please, and when we please. Any other relationship with existence appears as a frustration. So from the very beginning, we have fallen short of those convictions which we knew were right. And for one person who could honestly say that he had lived well, there would be 1,000 who could not say this without exaggeration. They get by, but in themselves they know they are not the person they ought to be. So out of this type of situation we have developed an almost universal guilt mechanism. It has become the common denominator of us all that we fall short. And the original word sin simply means to be less than we should be. And under that term, we are all sinners. Now, the next situation that has arisen is that codes and laws were universally believed to have originated in a divine power. And in the course of ages, we have developed elaborate theological, moral, and psychological systems. And in most of the theological systems, there is great emphasis upon the unseen. The universe of invisibles is held in religion to be more important than the visible world. And on religious philosophy, this can rather well be demonstrated. Because if man is an eternal creature, a great part of his eternal existence is not lived here. It is here we find only a fragment of the career of a being, if that being is eternal. Consequently, there must be a larger universe. There must be another world. There must be other places. And in theology, there have been elaborate explanations of these other places. There has been a wonderful description of heaven and of paradise and of places of blessedness and rest. Very few people, however, seem to have been greatly comforted by these stories. They evidently didn't expect to go to any such desirable spot. Also, religion has greatly exaggerated man's fear. It has created vast areas of punishment, region after region of perdition. It has made a large part of nature into hell. And into this hell it has tipped almost any human being who ever lived here. The very few who might earn a universal salvation by theology, this very few is comparatively incidental to the innumerable mass of humanity, which for one reason or another has little to hope for, theologically speaking. As man got a little more intelligent and a little more thoughtful about these things, he began to wonder. It became more and more obvious to him that all this theological paraphernalia seem to be intended for merely one purpose, and that is to frighten man into a state of grace. We've tried that for a long time, but it never works. The individual who is good only because he is afraid to be bad becomes the secret criminal. There has to be something else. The individual has to do well because he believes in good and not because he fears evil. But when we try this, it also does not operate successfully in a social order. The average individual does not love good as much as he fears evil. So perhaps this is the reason why, in his imagery of the universe around him, there is more of fear than of hope. The individual who has not learned to love good does not experience good in the universe. His faculties, inwardly unfolded to some degree, do not carry to him an experience of good. The very way we live and the very way we think causes this world to be a problem rather than a reward. It is a punishment. And many systems of philosophy have held that the entire life of man is nothing but payment for an original sin. All these morbid factors have to affect imagination and have to influence, rather morbidly, our internal reaction to the symbolisms of creative imagination. They become definitely morbid, neurotic symbols. If you study, for example, the art achievements of neurotic peoples, you find that today great experiments are being made in the artistic symbolism to be found in drawings and paintings by the mentally disturbed. These paintings, by the way, appear quite startlingly modernistic. And there is an historical account of an exhibition in which the works of mental patients and the works of prominent modernists were hung in a gallery together, mixed up, and no indication given as to which was by which group. The judges were supposed to sort them out. When the judges, all experts in modern art, came to their final conclusion, they gave the first award to a homicidal maniac. The actual disturbance which we find in psychological living today expresses itself in art. Now, what is the drawing or painting of a mental patient more than the projection of symbols? Projection from within the self. Instead of using the subtle fabric of mental energy now to create a symbol, the patient is using his hand and a brush or a pencil. He is expressing his own inward confusion, and he does so often dramatically, producing many spectacular and highly controversial pictures, which require a great deal of interpretation and study in order to determine their actual content. To a measure, man also, with his neurosis, interprets his whole universe. He makes with his own mental fingers modelings and shapes and diagrams and figures of his own peculiarities and places them upon the pedestals of nature. He is constantly working with this disordered content in his own nature and projecting it upon his environment. So altogether, we have much to explain why the majority of ghost stories are melancholy. We also realize how the story of Hamlet could well represent the maliciousness of revenge. how the disturbed mind, already heavy with doubts and subconscious fears, as was the mind of Prince Hamlet, could be led to a complete pattern of avengements. These avengements might be just. They might be well called for according to our way of thinking. But they destroyed the good and the bad. They left the individual the complete victim of a disorientation, whether we consider it a true ghost or a psychic ghost that caused the disorientation. Working constantly in this field of endeavor, I have become conscious through long familiarity with a great number of contemporary ghostly situations, and have come strongly to believe that the majority of them, at least, were psychological phenomena. That actually the ghost incident can be explained by the actual study of the person who has the experience. We know, for example, that more than 100 years ago, the planchette, that we now call the Ouija board, was publicly banned in France because it led to an epidemic of murder and suicide. Now, you would think that kindly, good-natured people sitting around, either consciously, subconsciously, or unconsciously pushing a little table, would occasionally come up with some very good news. Well, some of them did. There's no question about it. Most of the so-called good news consisted of consolation. Terribly lonely people, or those bereaved, found some comfort in actually or symbolically finding contact with those whom they had lost. But the overwhelming number of kindly, good-natured people moving a Ouija board got themselves into trouble. 9 out of 10 of these amateur psychics were finally victimized by their own psychism. Instead of coming out of the situation encouraged and strengthened, they developed all kinds of strange dependencies. And I remember very well the case of Ella Wheeler Wilcox, the American poetess. She believed that she contacted a person whom she loved. And as a result of her statements, this type of psychism gained sudden and extraordinary popularity. Later, she tried in every way possible to point out that this was exaggerated and that she realized that the publicity was leading to trouble. But of course, people do not listen when they do not want to hear. And the result is the mistakes were perpetuated and the timely warnings were forgotten. But in the case of the Ouija board, we have a very simple evidence of a situation that can apply to automatic writing, can apply to a great deal of personal psychism, and also to a large part of mediumship. Namely, that by degrees, a situation that perhaps begins with hope ends in terror. Now, why should this particular process be true? I think it is because if we could psychologically analyze man, we would find that there is a thin stratum of faith, but a very thick stratum of fear. The individual, under some pressure, or perhaps only for pleasure or social reasons, attempts some mediumistic activity. Naturally, it begins with a semi-believing. It begins perhaps with a little hope and a little confusion. And it is motivated by the most surface instincts of that person. He wishes to communicate with someone. There is no great moralism involved. He hopes that he can get a message or find a lost collar button or something. The level of the investigation is not profound. Suddenly, however, this person is caught in the peculiar net of his own psychism. He seems to be in the possession of a force or faculty which he cannot control. As time passes, he surrenders more and more of his consciousness and his common sense to this mysterious psychic faculty. And after a time, this faculty plumbs its way into the depths of his fear stratum. And little by little, what might have begun as a rather optimistic, cheerful, and even slightly profitable interest ends up by the person becoming as hopelessly addicted to a morbid state as any alcoholic or narcotic addict. Suddenly, the temper of this association begins to change. By degrees, ominous things are introduced. Very often it ends in a strange gibberish of demoniacal folly. The spirits suddenly seem to turn into imps and do nothing but punish us for some mysterious subjective fault that we have tried desperately to forget. All of this is a pattern, and it works out so systematically that we have to come to certain other conclusions relating to psychic phenomena. Actually, therefore, there is much that seems to suggest that these mysterious psychic journeys are into some form of subjective consciousness within the person, that there is a universe within him in which all of the archetypes of his own experiences are available, that this is a journey into expectancy, not into the unknown. It is a journey into the ways of things with which we are familiar. That it is no longer to be considered as a place, but as a mood, as a sphere of personal experiences. If this be true, then the mysterious ghosts that we find there must also have some existence in ourselves. Perhaps they are the ghosts of our old selves. Perhaps they are almost anything we want to imagine them to be. But some way they seem to tie psychologically into a kind of anticipated state of affairs. Now, in the course of psychism also, we get into a great many important problems involving communication. In the old days, most communication between the living and the dead was communication by oracle. And the great oracle at Delphi, or the oracle of Trophonius, or one of the other classic oracles of the Greeks and Latins, comes to our mind. But remember that in the oracle, as a means of interrogation, man did not attempt to communicate with man. Man sought the wisdom of the gods. Nearly all the state oracles of antiquity were for communication with deities, not with the deceased. These deities, as the guardians, leaders, guides, and custodians of peoples, were therefore, we may say, the archetypal pattern of the cultures which these deities were believed to sustain. Consequently, we are dealing with archetype. We are dealing with man trying to discover the laws of archetype in order that he could obey them better, that he could understand them more fully. Thus, in this we cannot say that there is a real consistency between modern and ancient psychic phenomena. Modern psychic phenomena nearly always involves some kind of communication with persons like ourselves, of similar nature, consciousness, and constitution. And we are then confronted with another situation. What does death produce in the experience of the individual? Assuming that we are right, that idealism is the correct approach to life, that therefore man survives the grave and remains a conscious being, and that this conscious being has a destiny and some kind of an abode, even if it is in the extra-dimensional vistas of space. If we assume that this person has passed from one condition to another, what does death do to that person other than to separate him from a body? Does death change him? Does death cause him to become aware of a greater world? Does death make him realize a higher level of personal integrity? Is the individual after death better than he was while he was alive? Well, Socrates argues that point a little and comes to a sort of general conclusion which has some merit in it. One thing that every entity that has passed consciously beyond death must know that the average person here does not know, but only believes, namely, that life is eternal, or at least that consciousness survives death. Now, this is an important thing if experienced by the individual with absolute certainty. If he does not experience it, then obviously he doesn't survive. And regardless of how he misinterprets it, if he survives as a conscious being even to misinterpret, he has survived. And the fact of his survival is inevitable. So we can say that he has certain values given by the very transition caused by death itself. We have no reason to assume that death and the world into which he passes would have any essential effect upon the development of skills or abilities which are peculiar to this world. It would not be, therefore, proper, I think, to believe that a carpenter who passed out of this life would be a better carpenter somewhere else, because he'd have very little opportunity to experiment if we are correctly informed. But that he does have a new dimension of understanding given by transition cannot be denied. Now, if we also want to take the ground that many do take, that this other world is a better place, that in some way the being who passes there becomes wiser, perhaps not more exactly wise or more skillfully wise, but perhaps more aware of the universal integrity. If it is assumed that this person, having departed from our way of life, comes closer to God, enters into a nearer relationship with the great causes of life, becomes more associated with divine beings, then we might have reason to assume, or right to suspect, that this person's integrity would be somewhat more matured, that they would have sense of value better than ours, and having been freed from the bondage of the limitation of the flesh, would have some intuitive or inspirational faculties more released, or at least not less released than they are here. This, in a way, causes us then to say, how can we have a vengeful ghost? How can a person who has passed into a better state remain concerned with the peculiarities and absurdities of his material condition? If an individual, by the process of death, gains contact with immortality or greater proximity to God how can he remain unforgiving? If his consciousness is changed at all by this experience, might we not expect him to be in some way better than he was here? Certainly no less. If he is conscious, if he has gone into a universe of causes in which he is actually living in a state which we are seeking desperately to find in order to advance our own knowledge, is there not reason to suppose that in this larger state the individual would be susceptible of somewhat larger thinking? If this is the case, then certainly the things that concerned him here would concern him less. Problems which he couldn't understand here he would intuitively grasp. And he would also have little interest in injuring those he has left behind, because he must be aware that injury has injured himself most of all. So to